Princess Victoria Alexandria was born on May the 24th, 1819 at Kensington Palace in London. Her father was Edward, the Duke of Kent, and her mother was Princess Victoria of Germany. She lived the life of a young royal, and her mother was very protective. She had little contact with other children, spending most of her days with adult tutors and playing with dolls when she was young. As she grew older, she enjoyed painting and drawing and writing in her diary. When Victoria was born, she was fifth in line for the crown of England. It seemed unlikely that she would ever be queen. However, after several of her uncles failed to have children, she became the heir to the throne of the current king, William IV. When William died in 1837, Victoria became Queen of the United Kingdom at the age of 18. Her official coronation took place on June 28, 1838, and she was determined to be a good queen and restore the faith of the people in the United Kingdom. One of the first things she did was pay off her father's debts, and people liked her from the start. On October 10, 1839, a German prince named Albert came to visit the royal court. Victoria immediately fell in love. 5 days later, they were engaged to be married, and she enjoyed happy married life. She and Albert had 9 children over the next several years. He also helped her with navigating the politics of England. On December the 14th, 1861, Albert passed away from typhoid fever. Victoria went into a deep depression. There was one point where many people questioned her ability to rule. Eventually she recovered, and she began to take a strong interest in the British Empire and its colonies. She took particular interest in India and gained the title Empress of India. Victoria's 9 children were married off to royalty throughout much of Europe. She is often called the grandmother of Europe because so many of Europe's monarchs are her relatives. Her first son, Edward, became king after her and married a princess from Denmark. Her daughter Victoria, the Princess Royal, married the Emperor of Germany. Other children married royals from all over Europe, including Russia. She had 37 great-grandchildren at the time of her death on January the 22nd, 1901. Oliver Cromwell was born on April 25, 1599 in Huntingdon, Cambridgeshire. He studied at Cambridge University and then he managed a small estate. However, he soon became interested in local politics. When he was 27, he had a religious experience and became a Puritan. The Puritans were Protestants who wanted to change the Church of England. He became convinced that he would be guided to carry out God's purpose. The people of Huntingdon chose him as their representative in Parliament in 1628, and he was a member of the Puritan-led Independent Party. Although he was a quiet man, Cromwell commanded great authority when he spoke. He gained a reputation as a strong supporter of Parliament against the king. In 1640, Cromwell was elected to represent Cambridge, and in 1642, a civil war broke out between Charles I and Parliament. With no military experience, Cromwell created and led a powerful force of cavalry soldiers, nicknamed the Ironsides. He persuaded Parliament to help him establish a professional army, the New Model Army, which won an important victory over the King's men at Naseby in 1645. By 1648, the Parliament had defeated the King, and Cromwell finally signed a piece of paper which declared the King, Charles, as a traitor, and the King was executed in 1649. As a ruler, Cromwell established Puritanism, but encouraged religious tolerance. He ended wars with Portugal and Holland, and made friends with France against Spain. He died in 1658 and was buried in Westminster Abbey. His eldest son was chosen to succeed him, but within 2 years the monarchy was restored. In 1661, Cromwell's body was dug up from its grave and hung. He then had his head cut off and put on public display. Henry VIII was the King of England and Ireland from the 21st of April 1509 until the 28th of January 1547, and is perhaps one of the most famous monarchs in English history. Born on the 28th of June 1491 at Greenwich Palace in London, Henry was the second eldest son to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. The young prince was never expected to become king, but when his older brother, Arthur, died unexpectedly at the age of 15, Henry became heir to the throne. Upon the death of his father, Henry was coronated on the 24th of June 1509, when he was just 17 years old. He immediately set out marrying his elder brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. The young Henry was said to be handsome, clever and fun, and in contrast to his boring father. He was over 6 feet tall and loved jousting, hunting, and composing music and throwing big, expensive parties. He loved spending money. But in his later years, all that indulgence took his toll on his physical health. The older King Henry was hugely overweight and struggled to walk. At the age of 50, he had a 54-inch waist, which is 137 centimetres. He also suffered from a gruesome ulcer on his leg that caused him constant pain. He was known for being a really ruthless king who ruled with an iron fist. He was strong-willed and bullish, and he handed out executions to anyone who stood in his way. In fact, during his 38-year reign, it is said that more than 70,000 people were executed. One of the biggest changes that Henry brings about during his reign is something called the English Reformation. After 24 years of marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, he doesn't have a son. So he's frustrated and he goes to the Pope to ask for a divorce, but the Pope won't allow it. So unhappy, Henry took matters into his own hands. He broke away from the Catholic Church and created his own church called the Church of England and named himself as the head. Henry is probably most famous for having 6 wives. He also has 3 surviving children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Henry died in 1547 at the age of 55, obese and riddled with health issues. He was buried at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle next to his 3rd wife and mother to his only surviving son, Jane Seymour. Upon his death, the son that Henry so desperately wanted inherited the throne as Edward VI. He was just 9 years old. The next person we'll look at is William the Conqueror. William was born in 1028 in Normandy in France. His father was the powerful Robert I, Duke of Normandy, but his mother was the daughter of a local tanner. His parents weren't married, which made William an illegitimate child. Despite being illegitimate, William grew up and was raised as a future Duke of Normandy. When he was 7 years old, his father decided to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Since William was his only son, Robert assembled his nobles and had to swear that William would be his heir when he died. When Robert died in his return trip from Jerusalem, William was made Duke of Normandy, and he was crowned the Duke of Normandy in 1035. In 1050, he married Matilda of Flanders, and then in 1066 the King of England, Edward the Confessor, died, and he hadn't left any heirs to the throne. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. However, there were other men who also claimed the crown of England. One of them was the most powerful noble in England at the time, called Harold Godwinson. The people of England wanted Harold to be the king, and crowned him King Harold II on January 6, 1066, the day after Edward died. After King Harold II defeated Norwegian invaders, he then turned south to face William, who had invaded because he thought he should be the king. William, however, was ready for battle. He had brought archers and heavily armoured cavalry called knights. Harold's foot soldiers were no match for William's forces, and William won the battle and King Harold II was killed by an arrow. He continued to march across England and eventually captured the city of London. Shortly after, on December 25th, 1066, William was crowned the King of England. So the first monarch that you will look in this topic is this man here, Alfred the Great. Now there are many famous Anglo-Saxon kings, but the most famous of all was Alfred, one of the only kings in British history to be called great. His father was the King of Wessex, but by the end of Alfred's reign his coins referred to him as the King of the English. He fought the Vikings and then made peace so that the English and the Vikings settled down to live together. He encouraged people to learn and he tried to govern well and fairly. A lot of what we know about Alfred the Great comes from stories that have been written about him. One story says that Alfred went to Rome at the age of 4 to meet the Pope. When he came home, his mother promised a book of English poetry to the first of her sons who could read it to her. With the help of his tutor, Alfred memorised the book so he could recite it by heart and won. Later in his life, the young King Alfred had to hide from the Vikings on a marshy land in Somerset. A famous story tells how, while sheltering in a cowherd's hut, the king got a telling off from the cowherd's wife. He accidentally let her cakes burn on fire when he forgot to watch them. Alfred became the king in 871 AD, when his elder brother died. He was advised by a council of nobles and church leaders, and this council was called the Witan. He made good laws and believed education was important. He had books translated from Latin into English so people could read them. He also told monks to begin writing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. To help protect his kingdom from Viking attacks, Alfred built forts and walled towns known as burhs. He also built warships to guard the coast from raiders and organised his army into two parts. While half the men were at home on their farms, the rest were ready to fight the Vikings. Alfred died in 899 and was buried at his capital city of Winchester.